Donald Trump has officially moved beyond minor trade skirmishes and entered into a total economic war with Canada. This is no longer about a single product, like softwood lumber or a temporary tax on steel. The Trump administration has launched what experts call a full-spectrum escalation. This means they are attacking Canada's economy from every possible angle at the exact same time. On a single Tuesday morning, before the Canadian government in Ottawa could even finish its first morning coffee or staff briefing, the White House activated a massive pre-planned strike. They didn't just announce one problem, they triggered trade barriers to stop goods, travel restrictions to stop people, financial penalties to freeze money, and intense diplomatic pressure to isolate Canada from its allies. By hitting every major part of the relationship simultaneously, the US intended to paralyze the Canadian government before it could even formulate a defense. This coordinated strike was designed to be a shock and awe campaign for the economy. In the past, trade disputes followed a predictable pattern. The US would complain about a specific product, Canada would respond, and they would negotiate for months. That era is over. By launching these attacks across 5 different federal agencies at once, the Trump administration signaled that it is no longer interested in fixing specific trade issues. Instead, it is using the entire weight of the American economy as a weapon to force total submission. This includes making it harder for Canadian officials to travel, increasing the cost for Canadian companies to do business in US dollars, and threatening to cut off the deep diplomatic ties that have existed for over 80 years. The sheer scale of this move is meant to show that the US is willing to dismantle the most successful trading relationship in history to get what it wants. Prime Minister Mark Carney's reaction to this unprecedented move was almost instant, but the nature of his response shocked observers in Washington and across the globe. Usually, when the US raises a tariff, Canada raises a similar tariff in return. This is called tit-for-tat retaliation. However, Carney didn't do that. He skipped the usual legal complaints and minor trade penalties. According to high-level sources within the Canadian Privy Council office, the top-tier group that advises the Prime Minister, Carney activated the reserve option. This was a secret, break-glass-in-case-of-emergency plan that Canada had been holding in the shadows since January. It is the most extreme response in the Canadian playbook, and it was created specifically for a scenario where the US stops acting like a partner and starts acting like an adversary. The reason this reserve option is so significant is that it represents a point of no return. In diplomacy, there are usually off-ramps, ways for both sides to stop fighting and save face. But by choosing this path, Canada has signaled that it is done trying to play by the old rules. This isn't a trade war in the traditional sense because traditional trade wars have rungs on a ladder that you can climb back down. What is happening now is a direct, documented showdown between the leader of the United States and a fellow G7 nation. For the first time in modern history, Canada has decided at the highest levels of government that trying to please or accommodate the Trump administration is a failing strategy. Instead of trying to find a middle ground, Canada is now standing its ground with a strategy that assumes the old friendship is effectively dead, at least for now. This shift marks a fundamental change in the global order. When 2 of the world's closest allies move from cooperation to an all-out economic battle, it creates a threshold event. This means the relationship has been pushed so far that even if the dispute ends tomorrow, things will never truly go back to the way they were. The trust has been broken at a structural level. Canada's decision to stop seeking accommodation means they are no longer looking for a win-win deal. They are now focused purely on sovereign survival and counter-pressure. This is a high-stakes gamble where Canada is betting that its own internal resolve and legal preparation can withstand the full weight of American executive power. The world is watching because if Canada succeeds, it provides a blueprint for every other US ally on how to fight back against total economic pressure. The event that triggered this entire economic crisis was the release of the Canada Economic Accountability Package. This was not just a simple announcement, it was a massive, pre-planned operation released by the White House at exactly 8:30 a.m. on April 7, 2026. To make this happen, the Trump administration coordinated 5 different federal agencies at once, ensuring that the impact would hit every part of the Canadian economy at the same moment. The most aggressive part of this package was a 40% across-the-board tariff. This tax applies to every single Canadian good that wasn't already being taxed by previous trade measures. This means that almost everything Canada sells to the United States, from raw materials to finished products, suddenly became 40% more expensive to bring across the border, effectively trying to choke off Canadian trade overnight. Beyond just taxes on goods, the package launched a personal and professional attack on the Canadian government through a new visa restriction regime. This policy targeted Canadian government officials and their immediate families, making it difficult or impossible for them to enter the United States. By targeting families, the administration moved the conflict out of the boardroom and into the personal lives of Canadian leaders. At the same time, the White House introduced strict new financial reporting requirements for any Canadian company doing business in the US. While these are called reporting requirements, trade lawyers quickly identified them as de facto sanctions. These rules make it so expensive and legally complicated for Canadian firms to operate in America that many would be forced to stop their US operations entirely just to avoid the massive compliance costs. The most controversial and shocking part of the April 7th package was a formal presidential determination regarding the USMCA trade treaty. President Trump officially declared that Canada's decision to use the treaty's own legal dispute panels was an unfriendly act against the United States. Usually, when two countries have a disagreement about a treaty, they use these panels to settle it fairly. By calling this an unfriendly act, the president used it as a legal excuse to suspend all preferential trade treatment for Canada. This essentially means the US is ignoring the special lower tax rates and rules that were promised in the USMCA agreement. It sends a message that the US will only follow the rules of a treaty when those rules benefit the executive branch, and will ignore them if a legal panel rules in favor of Canada. This specific move regarding the USMCA left constitutional scholars and legal experts completely stunned. The USMCA is a formal treaty that was debated by Congress, passed by the House of Representatives, ratified by the Senate, and signed into law. By declaring that the treaty's own legal process is unfriendly, the executive branch is basically claiming it has the power to treat a federal law as optional. This is a massive shift in how the US government functions. It suggests that the president can bypass a treaty whenever its legal outcomes become inconvenient. This isn't just a problem for Canada. It signals to every other country that an agreement made with the United States might not be worth the paper it is written on, if the administration decides to change its mind later. The global reaction to this package was immediate and filled with panic, because this move threatened the very idea of international law and treaty reliability. America's other major allies didn't wait for a press briefing to react. Governments in cities like Tokyo, Brussels, and Canberra began making urgent diplomatic calls to each other before the sun had even set in Washington. They realized that if the US could unilaterally discard a treaty with its closest neighbor and largest trading partner, then no alliance or trade deal in the world was safe. This package didn't just start a fight with Canada, it created a massive crisis of confidence in American credibility that made the entire world question whether the United States could still be trusted as a stable partner in the global economy. The decision to launch the full-spectrum escalation was not a random choice. It was born out of the total failure of every previous attempt the United States made to force Canada into submission. Before April 7th, the Trump administration had tried several specific pressure tactics, including targeting the auto industry with high tariffs, making aggressive demands regarding wheat exports, and threatening Canada's energy sector. In every single instance, the US expected Canada to fold under the pressure. Instead, the opposite happened. Each American move was met by a Canadian response that was faster, more legally precise, and better coordinated with international allies than the one before. Canada didn't just react, they anticipated the moves and had counter-strategies ready to go. This left the White House frustrated because their usual maximum pressure tactics were simply not working against the government in Ottawa. According to detailed reporting from the Financial Times and the Washington Post, the White House only moved to the April 7th full-spectrum attack because of a very specific internal theory. The administration's trade policy team had created an economic model which predicted that if the US applied extreme multidimensional pressure for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, the Canadian business community would eventually break. The US calculation was based on the idea that Canadian CEOs, bank directors, and corporate leaders would become so afraid of losing money that they would turn against Prime Minister Mark Carney. The White House believed these powerful business interests would launch a massive domestic lobbying campaign to force the Canadian government to give up and accept Washington's terms. They viewed the Canadian private sector as the weak link that would eventually snap under the weight of US sanctions and tariffs. However, this internal US modeling turned out to be completely wrong. Instead of the Canadian business community fracturing and turning on their own government, they actually did the exact opposite. They hardened their support for Ottawa. Major Canadian corporations realized that if they gave in to bullying now, they would be vulnerable to similar threats forever. Rather than calling Carney to demand a surrender, Canadian business leaders coordinated with the government to find new markets and strengthen domestic supply chains. The US had fundamentally misunderstood the mindset of Canadian corporate leadership, assuming they would choose short-term profits over long-term national sovereignty. By the time the April 7th package was released, the very corporate fracture the US was counting on had failed to materialize, leaving the Trump administration's entire strategy based on a false assumption. Beyond the business community, the Trump administration also completely misread the mood of the Canadian public. On the very morning the escalation was launched, a new poll revealed that a staggering 74% of Canadians supported the government's tough confrontational stance against Washington. This level of public unity is incredibly rare in a democracy, but the US pressure had effectively unified Canadians across all political lines. The White House had expected the Canadian people to get angry at their own leaders for the rising costs of the trade war. Instead, the Canadian public saw the US actions as an unfair attack on their country, which only increased their resolve to back the Prime Minister. The US administration had operated under the belief that they could drive a wedge between the Canadian people and their government, but their tactics actually acted as the glue that held the country together. In the end, the failure of the US modeling shows a massive intelligence and cultural gap in the White House's approach. They underestimated the strategic resolve of Mark Carney's leadership team, which had been quietly preparing for this exact scenario for months. They also underestimated the deep-seated sense of national unity that emerges in Canada when the country feels its fundamental rights and treaties are being ignored by its largest neighbour. By relying on flawed data and a misunderstanding of Canadian psychology, the Trump administration launched its biggest economic weapon into a room that was far more prepared and united than they ever imagined. This miscalculation didn't just lead to a failed policy, it pushed Canada to activate its most extreme reserve options, turning a trade dispute into a permanent geopolitical rift. The speed and precision of Canada's response to the American escalation was designed to show the world that Ottawa was not caught off guard. The Canadian government officially received the diplomatic transmission of the US accountability package at 9:04 a.m. Most governments would have taken days to analyze such a massive set of threats, but Prime Minister Mark Carney took only 56 minutes. By 10 a.m., he was already walking into the House of Commons. The choice of location was a critical part of his message. He avoided the National Press Theatre and instead chose the floor of the elected Parliament. This signaled that he wasn't just giving a media statement, he was speaking as the leader of a sovereign democracy, addressing his people and their elected representatives. The chamber was packed, even though opposition members had only been given 40 minutes' notice, showing the intense gravity of the moment. When Carney stood at the dispatch box, the atmosphere was completely silent. He chose to speak without notes, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his message to a global audience, including viewers on BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera. His voice was described as entirely steady. He wasn't shouting or being overly dramatic. He spoke with the calm authority of someone delivering a final verdict, rather than someone trying to win an argument. He began by reminding the international community of Canada's long history as a reliable and faithful partner. He pointed to Canada's consistent contributions to NATO, NORAD, and almost every major international peacekeeping mission since 1945. His core message was simple. Canada has always honored the agreements it signs, and it has been a neighbor that the United States could count on for decades. After establishing Canada's track record, Carney shifted his tone and dropped the hammer on the legal reality of the US actions. He told the world that Canada's legal experts had already conducted a full review of the American package and found it to be a massive violation of international law. Specifically, he announced that the US measures violated 7 distinct provisions of the USMCA Treaty and 3 major articles of the World Trade Organization's WTO General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. By listing these specific violations on the record in Parliament, Carney was telling the global financial markets and other world leaders that the United States was the party breaking the law. He argued that a country cannot call a treaty partner's use of legal dispute tools an unfriendly act without destroying the very foundation of international cooperation. The climax of the speech came when Carney revealed the existence of the reserve instrument. This was a four-part retaliatory plan that the Canadian government had been refining in total secrecy since January 2026. This plan had been kept in a sealed brief and required the Prime Minister's personal authorization to be opened. It was not a set of minor trade penalties. It was a structural response designed to hit back at American interests in ways that could not be ignored. By revealing this now, Carney was showing that Canada had been prepared for this exact moment for 4 months. He made it clear that Ottawa was no longer interested in a polite trade dispute. They were now activating a strategy designed to protect Canadian sovereignty by any legal and economic means necessary, moving the conflict into a new and much more serious phase. This stand by Carney was seen as a turning point in the entire confrontation because it took the fight out of the shadows and put it onto the world stage. By speaking from the House of Commons and directly challenging the legality of the US actions, he forced every other allied nation to take a side. He wasn't just defending Canada, he was defending the entire system of international treaties that the world has relied on for decades. The fact that the entire House of Commons, including his political rivals, rose in a standing ovation, showed that his stand had unified the country. Carney had successfully moved from being a leader managing a trade problem to a leader defending a nation's fundamental right to exist as a sovereign power. The first and most explosive part of Canada's counterstrike was the immediate suspension of $38.6 billion in funding for NORAD modernization. While Canada made it clear that it is not leaving the NORAD alliance, it is officially freezing the bank account for the massive upgrades needed to protect North American airspace. This money was supposed to build advanced over-the-horizon radar systems in Ontario and the Arctic, upgrade satellite communications and modernize command centers. By stopping this funding, Canada sent a shockwave directly into the Pentagon. Because the US and Canada build these systems together, the suspension effectively halts multi-billion-dollar contracts for defense companies in 20 different US states. These companies, which employ thousands of American workers, were counting on Canadian money to start production. Now those projects are in legal and financial limbo, forcing the US military to explain to Congress why a trade fight is suddenly creating a massive hole in North American national security. The second pillar of the plan was a direct move to bypass the United States entirely by building a new multilateral trade framework. Prime Minister Carney didn't just threaten to find new partners, he formally notified the leaders of Germany, France, the UK, Japan, and Australia that Canada is ready to accelerate a parallel trade architecture. The goal is to link the economies of these middle powers so closely that they no longer have to rely on the American market to survive. For decades, Canada's economy has been tied to the US out of necessity. Carney is now attempting to change that reality by creating a rules-based alliance with other wealthy nations that actually follow their treaty commitments. This isn't just a small trade deal, it is a structural shift designed to strip the United States of its economic leverage. If these countries successfully build this new system, the US could find itself on the outside of a massive global trade bloc that it no longer controls. The third pillar was a high-stakes legal attack launched on two fronts, the USMCA and the World Trade Organization, WTO. By filing complaints in both places at the same time, Canada created a dual-forum legal trap for the United States. Usually a country picks one place to fight a trade case. By picking both, Canada is forcing the US government to hire and manage two separate teams of lawyers to defend the same actions under different sets of international rules. This strategy is designed to be exhausting and expensive for Washington. While the Trump administration might try to ignore a USMCA ruling, it is much harder to ignore the WTO, which involves almost every country on Earth. This move ensures that the US will be constantly defending itself in international courts for years to come, keeping the pressure on and making it clear to global investors that the American trade position is legally indefensible. Finally, Carney delivered a direct, 90-second address to the American people that bypassed the White House entirely. He spoke past the politicians and looked straight into the cameras to reach American farmers, auto workers, and small business owners. His message was simple and direct. Canada is not your enemy, but this confrontation is costing you money. He asked these everyday Americans to look at the rising prices of their energy, the loss of their export contracts to Canada, and the uncertainty in their factories. By doing this, Carney was attempting to spark a domestic political backlash within the United States. He wanted American voters to realize that the accountability package was actually hurting them more than it was hurting Canada. This move was designed to force US senators and representatives to hear from their own angry constituents, creating internal pressure on the Trump administration to stop the escalation and return to the negotiating table. To truly grasp why this confrontation is so serious, we have to look at two major historical events that show how powerful nations handle extreme pressure. Many experts first point to the 1956 Suez Crisis. In that event, the United States used its financial power to bully its own allies, the United Kingdom and France. The US threatened to crash the British currency, the pound, if they didn't stop a military operation in Egypt. It worked. The UK and France backed down immediately. While President Eisenhower won that specific fight, he caused permanent damage. The British people felt betrayed by their best friend, and it took decades for that trust to return. Some in the White House thought they could do the same thing to Canada in 2026, apply enough financial pain to force a quick surrender. However, the Suez strategy is failing because Canada is not acting like Britain did in 1956. Canada is not backing down or withdrawing. Instead, the better historical comparison for today is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This wasn't just a random fight, it was a high-stakes structural dynamic. In that crisis, the side that won wasn't necessarily the one with the biggest ego, but the one that prepared most thoroughly, communicated its red lines most clearly, and showed the most consistent resolve. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, victory came from making the other side realize that you are willing to go all the way to protect your interests. Canada has adopted this exact mindset. By preparing for months and responding with legal precision, Prime Minister Carney has signaled that Canada isn't just reacting to a trade war, they are managing a national security crisis with the same level of seriousness used during the Cold War. This shift is why the NORAD suspension is so revolutionary. Richard Nephew, a world-renowned expert on economic sanctions, has stated that this is the single most important move Canada has made in its history. By halting the $38.6 billion for aerospace defense, Canada did something the White House never expected. They linked trade directly to national security. In the past, trade disputes were just about money, taxes, and business profits. The Pentagon and the military usually stayed out of it. But by freezing the funds for North American defense, Canada has forced the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon to get involved. The generals are now realizing that a trade fight started by the White House is actually making America less safe by stopping the modernization of our radar and missile defense systems. By moving the fight into the realm of national security, Canada has changed the internal conversation in Washington. Trade policy is no longer just a boring debate about the price of goods. It is now a debate about continental defense capability. The Trump administration's trade team no longer has total control over this conflict, because the defense establishment is now knocking on the door of the Oval Office. The Pentagon cannot ignore the fact that the accountability package has caused a G7 ally to stop building the very tools we need to monitor the Arctic and protect US cities from aerial threats. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis dynamic in action. Canada has created a situation where the US military must now pressure its own government to settle the trade dispute, so that national security projects can resume. Ultimately, Canada's strategy is built on the fact that they have more to lose, and have therefore prepared more deeply. In the Suez Crisis, the UK was caught off guard and panicked. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, success came from being the most disciplined person in the room. Canada is following the disciplined path. They aren't just sending angry tweets, they are filing documented legal challenges and suspending massive military contracts that hit the US where it hurts most. They have moved the escalation ladder to a level where the US must decide if winning a trade argument is worth losing a century-old defense partnership. This is a fundamental test of resolve, and by linking trade to the safety of the continent, Canada has ensured that this showdown will be remembered by history as the moment the old rules of diplomacy were rewritten.